My name is Balmes Pavlov, and I'm a technical support specialist at Pace University. I've been there for about the last 2 years, and mostly what I do there is desktop support for staff and students. And in my time there, because there really hasn't been any kind of Mac support, what I've been trying to do is kind of make the support of Macs an easier process and a more efficient process for the technicians that work there, so that they can get rid of the computers quickly and the clients can get their computers back in a quicker fashion. So just real quickly, the agenda that I'm going to go over today, I'm going to talk about the environment that I work in. I'm going to discuss how to create images using InstaDMG. Then I'll kind of guide you through setting up DeployStudio for a line server and NetBooting across subnets and VLANs, which is an issue that some people come up with when they're doing NetBooting in their organizations. And lastly, I'll talk about converting Windows 7 images for boot camp and virtual machines. All right, so at Pace University, IT is mostly centralized. The area that I work in, which is client support, we handle a few servers, mostly for imaging, so we have to back up hard drives as soon as we're working on them for students. But then usually we just wipe the machine and re-image them with our Windows 7 images. And like I said, mostly everything is a Microsoft product running the services there. So Windows servers for most services. There's XP and Windows 7 for client OS, SCCM, Forefront, Active Directory, Group Policy, Microsoft Linked, and so on. So as you can probably imagine, our PCs are really well managed, but our Macs aren't managed at all. So right now, the process is, people get a Mac and they open it up and it's like they're getting it from the Apple store. They're not pre-imaged. They don't have any special software. So I tried to improve that process. And among our students, and this might be the case at other universities, we've noticed that they become more popular every year. But ironically, one of the more popular requests from our students is to install Windows on them so that they can get the ability to run Windows-only specific software. So I don't know how many people here work at universities. We have to deal with a program called Stat Tools. Does anyone use that? No? That runs only on Excel, but only for Windows, which is really annoying. So kind of just jumping into imaging. About 2 years ago, when I kind of got there at Pace, I had to kind of research options for imaging. And I was already familiar with the monolithic method of imaging, which most people should be familiar with. It's the golden image standard. So you basically set up a machine, you install the OS, the applications you want, configure the settings, and kind of copy that to other models, other computers with the same model. And so this process, it's an easy thing to replicate. The image works. It's guaranteed to work if you use the same model. But the problem is that it carries lots of cruft. So this is stuff that's machine specific that gets left behind that you have to kind of clear up. So if you were to take an image of an iMac and apply it to a MacBook Air, well, the MacBook Air doesn't have an Ethernet port, so the network interfaces might get screwed up a bit when you apply an image that way. And this process also, when you think about it, it's pretty time consuming to maintain these images because you're doing it by model. So in a process like this, you're going to have a lot of different images per model, depending on how you're maintaining your images. It's going to require a lot more space because you have to have those models around to update every so often, if you even update them at all. With the modular method of imaging, you're basically taking packages and applying it to a disk image. So it's a bit different. There's a lot of packaging involved, or at least understanding how packages work. And so there's a steeper learning curve. But I found, at least for myself, that it was pretty well worth it to get it down packed. And so the tool that I used was InstaDMG, which creates a clean and never booted OS disk image. And depending on the OS updates that are out there, you can kind of create a universal image for all your Macs at the time. So once you learn the tool and you've got the packages down, it's pretty easy to maintain because all you have to do is run the tool itself and let it run in the background and create the image for yourself. So it's a very repeatable process. And because you're dealing with packages, you can use these packages in other tools like DeployStudio, Monkey. If you have Casper Suite or Absolute Manage, whatever the case is, you can use them in other products. So one thing, when I came last year to the conference for MacAdmins, they kind of talked about monolithic imaging and then modular imaging, which is what I'm going to focus on. But they also mentioned thin imaging, which I wasn't, I didn't even think about it, but it does make sense in some environments. And what that is you're taking the packages and applying it to a Mac out of the box, so you're not even re-imaging the machine. And this might be beneficial, especially for the newer Macs. Let's say you haven't packaged iLife 2011. All new Macs that come with it, if you re-image it or you use the recovery partition, it gets that program gets wiped out. So if you want to reinstall the application, you have to go to the Mac App Store. But what happens is that application now gets tied to that Apple ID, which is user-specific, not machine-specific. So things like that, it might be beneficial to use thin imaging. If you don't have a lot of applications, you can go with that method. And you don't even have to use a lot of packages. You can just install a software deployment tool like Monkey or the JSS agent. So whatever you use to deploy your software, you can just put that on top of the Mac out of the box. So the tool that I've used, like I said, was InstaDMG and InstaUpToDate, which is a component on top of InstaDMG. It's a tool that can be downloaded at this link. And don't worry about copying these links. These slides are going to be available after the conference is over. And it creates a never-booted OS image that's fully up to date. You can add packages to it. So if you want just more than the operating system, this will be a great thing to use InstaDMG for. And it supports up to now Leopard, Snow Leopard, and Line. And I mentioned earlier, you can create universal images based on the combo updates that are available. So when 10.7.0 came out, there were about 3 or 4 different builds. There was one from the Mac App Store, which you could use to update any machine running Snow Leopard. And that would apply to a lot of hardware. Then there was specific ones for the MacBook Air and then the Mac Mini at the time, and then a separate one for USB installer. Well, you couldn't keep one image. You would have to maintain at least 3 images if you use this tool. But when they released 10.7.2, you were able to use the combo update, and that combo update would work on any hardware model that was out at the time. And it's still the case with 10.7.3, and hopefully with 10.7.4 when that comes out. So this tool is very read-write intensive. So the faster the drive is that you're running this on, the quicker your images will be created. And it's also recommended that you have an external hard drive to create your images, just to speed up the process. So if you have a solid-state drive that you haven't used, this might be a good tool to use this on. And just a quick note, it doesn't recreate the recovery partition. So people sometimes ask that. Especially when Line came out, if it recreated the recovery partition. There are ways to do that, and I'll include that in a supplemental slides. I just couldn't include it in the presentation here today. But there are ways to recreate the recovery partition for Line using other tools out there. All right, so I'm going to show you how to create an image using InstaDMG in 3 easy steps. The first thing you'll want to do is open up Terminal. It's a terminal. It's a command line tool, and you just write this command here. It downloads the SVN repository for InstaDMG, and it creates a folder in your home user directory. And then you see a bunch of lines. It downloads, pretty straightforward. So then you move on to step 2, which is importing the OS X retail disk. So for Line, that doesn't exist anymore because it's on the App Store. So what you have to do is you have to go to the Mac App Store, purchase the application, and it's going to go download to the applications folder. So you're going to want to right-click that and choose Show Package Contents. And when you get there, you're going to see a folder called Contents. You're going to click on that, then open Shared Support, and you're going to find the install esd.gng file, which you're going to then copy over to your InstaDMG directory. So it's going to be under InstaDMG, installer files, and then installer disks. And all you got to do is just copy and paste or just drag and drop. For older operating systems, 10.5 and 10.6, it's a bit different. You do need the retail disk. So put that into your Mac, and then in Terminal you type out this command, which will import that into InstaDMG, and it takes about 40 minutes or so. Just you can kind of leave it running and then come back. You can do the same thing if you wanted to with 10.7, but it's not very necessary. Kind of just adds unnecessary time to the process. And then the last step is you're running Insta up to date so that it can process a catalog file that contains the latest updates, and it also looks for specific build numbers for the OS X installers. So once it finds that, it processes the installer, it adds the updates to it, and you pretty much get your your vanilla image from this catalog. And at this point, when I did this screenshot, I created a 10.7.3 image that was fully up to date. So with InstaDMG, you're going to probably want to update it every so often, especially when Apple comes out with updates. Because it's a very simple process, as you just saw, to create a disk image that's fully up to date. So if they release new Java updates, you can edit the catalog file yourself if it hasn't been updated on the InstaDMG repository. But you just run this simple command, svn update InstaDMG, and it just updates it. And just keep in mind, if you're not familiar with terminal, by default it opens up in your home user directory. So if you've messed around with that or changed the directory for whatever reason, just make sure you're updating the InstaDMG directory in the right location. All right, so I've mentioned Insta Up to Date a few times. So it's a component that's added on top of InstaDMG, and it adds extra functionality so that you can manage your workflows a bit better. Basically, the big thing with it is that you can have these catalogs, and these catalogs contain lists of packages that get processed by InstaDMG. And so these packages you can use include DMGs, so we're talking the drag and drop installers. You can even process the ones that contain packages in the DMG, and then of course PKG and MPKG files as well. And the packages can be hosted locally on your machine. That's the way I run it. Or if you have a web server you want to keep them on, you can do that as well, and download them over HTTP links. And like I said, catalogs, they allow you to manage your workflows a bit better. And there's a feature that allows you to link catalogs so that you can make the process of supporting different images a lot better. So I drew this diagram to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to managing your workflow. The catalogs you see on the top of the screen, most of them come with InstaDMG. The ones for Pace, Office 2011, and base settings I had to create myself. But let's say you're managing a few different groups, departments, or a different set of users. In my case, I have one for students and staff, images that I have to maintain. And let's say the staff image is going to need the OS. It's going to have Office. It's going to have free open source software, which is what the Pace catalog contains. And then you want your user, you want your administrator account added on, and then other setting configurations. The student image is going to be pretty similar, except you're not going to put the administrator account on it, and you don't want any kind of configurations on it. So by managing your catalogs and linking them up with other catalogs, you can kind of say, well, with my student catalog, I don't want the base settings catalog, and I don't want any of those packages to get processed. This is something that I learned a few months down the road after already using this tool. Initially, when I started using the tool, I was taking just one catalog and kind of deleting each line or commenting it out. And I realized, it's not very efficient. Sometimes I might forget to remove a certain package. And so this comes in very handy. So there's an example of what a catalog would look like. This is the one I use. A lot of this stuff is just open source, free software you can get. Firefox, VLC, and so on. Some of them I have to repackage, like Flash. Some of them I have to put in DMG containers like Cord. But it's pretty straightforward. This might not be the best catalog example, but there are other examples and templates you can use when you download InstaDMG, so you can get an idea of how to create these catalog files. So that was just a regular catalog, and now this is one that would just link up a bunch of catalogs. So you use the line include -file : and then it references other catalogs, and it processes those catalogs in that particular order you have them in. So here you can see it goes through the OS, vanilla catalog, then Office, Link, Paste software, and so on. And then the volume name for the final disk image you have is going to be Macintosh HD, and then the file name, whatever you choose to name it. So with this tool, packaging is pretty important. If you want to add additional applications to your image, it's good to get familiar with it. There are a lot of tools that do this. I won't cover them, but I added some of the tools that are out there that I know of. I don't know if anyone knows of other tools aside from these. No. But with these tools, even though it's good to know how to use them, I would avoid repackaging if possible. You only want to repackage an application if it's giving you a lot of trouble. So early on when I was using this, I would have to do it for Adobe products, and that was just a nightmare. I never really got it working. But I do this for, let's say, Final Cut Studio 3. That's a big application, and it takes a while to package it up. But I have my 50 gigabyte package, and I can include that in my InstaDMG image for my lab image that I maintain. Insta Up to Date has flags or options you can trigger. And so if you have an external hard drive, this flag is pretty useful. Basically, it creates a scratch disk so that you can write files onto an external hard drive to process your image quicker. And it's a simple command. It's basically what I showed you earlier to create a vanilla image, except at the end of it, you would write --instadmg--scratch--folder, and then just refer to the external volume that you have connected to your Mac. So just a tip when using this tool, I would recommend that you create a separate partition on your Mac or a test machine that you might have, so that you can constantly apply your image and see how it works. Because even though the tool will consistently create a OS X image without any problems, if you start adding packages to it, some of those packages might not apply correctly, or it might not behave the same way. So I would always test when you're using this tool. So now that you have your OS X image, right, you want to use a tool to deploy it. So the one I started using was DeployStudio. So it's a free image deployment tool you can download. It creates images. You can deploy images and configure them. So I don't use it for creating images, but I do use it to deploy images. You can download it at DeployStudio.com, and the screenshots I'm going to show you are of the stable release version. And some people ask this a lot. It's only available for OS X that I know of. It's a free tool, so you can't really complain, but it's only available for OS X, so you're going to need to run this on a Lion server or Snow Leopard server if you have one. So the three components to DeployStudio. There's the DeployStudio Assistant that it's basically a wizard that helps you configure the server and create NetBoot sets. There's a DeployStudio admin tool, which is a control panel for creating workflows, images, scripts, packages. And then there's a runtime tool, which actually executes those workflows and tasks that you use to deploy your images. You can use DeployStudio in two ways. You can host them on an external hard drive. So you've got a FireWire hard drive. You can plug that into other Macs, and this would work just fine. Or you can host the images on a server, which is what I do. So before configuring DeployStudio, I would recommend, you don't have to do it this way. You can use static IPs, but I would recommend getting the DNS reservation for that server that you're going to run DeployStudio on. You're also going to need the server administrator tools from the Apple website. And keep in mind, DeployStudio does let you create workflows. And because of this, anyone that logs in will have access to these workflows when they run the DeployStudio runtime tool. But there's a functionality that allows you to restrict access to based on user groups. So if you have Open Directory or Active Directory, I would recommend trying to use that if you want to restrict access based on groups that are available on your campus. So if you don't have any of that and you wish to set it up, you can set up Open Directory. I would use the server admin app. I've tried using it, doing it through the server app, and I didn't really have much luck with that. I had to reimage and recreate my server when I did that. And if you're using Active Directory, you would have to bind your Mac to AD, and there's a tool to do that, which is located under System, Library, Core Services, and then using the Directory Utility app to do that. Other things to keep in mind, you're going to want to set up a file share point. So in this presentation, I'm going to create an AFP share, but you can use CIFS as well for the DeployStudio repository. And you're going to need to enable the NetBoot service on your line server. And sort of to reiterate about DNS, you should get the reservation on your Mac, but it doesn't have to be a DNS service that's running on that Mac. It could be running on another Mac server, Windows server, Linux server, whatever the case is. And the same thing for DHCP. So you can run that on other servers. It doesn't have to be on that DeployStudio server. All right, so the first thing you want to do is create that file share, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to open up the server app. It's located under Applications. And you're going to click on File Sharing. You're going to click on the plus button, and it's going to give you a pop-up to select the folder you want to choose to share out. So I created one called DeployStudio under Groups. And the repository, what it does, it contains the database information that DeployStudio uses. It's going to contain the workflows, images, packages, and scripts that you're going to have. So here you can see that the file share is being created. So after it's been created, you can turn on the file sharing. I didn't take a screenshot with it actually turned on. But you want to turn that on because otherwise none of this will work. And then select the share point. And you're going to edit that to set up user access. So first you want to set up and make sure that AFP is configured. It should be selected by default. And then you want to set up a user account or user groups that have read-write access to that file share. So here you can see I added two groups, DSProd and DSTest, so that they can have read-write access to this DeployStudio repo. Yeah, I don't think it lets you, like when you're running the setup assistant, it won't let you authenticate. Like, at least that's been my experience, because you can also use the program to write images. So,
Oh, yeah, right.
So after you've got your file share, the next thing you want to do is enable a NetBoot service. So you're going to use the server admin app. And that's not to be confused with the server app. It's usually located after you install it in Applications and then the server folder. And it's going to prompt you, if this is the first time running it, for the server IP address or name and your user credentials. So just put that in. When you're in, click on the Settings button and the Services tab, and check off on the NetBoot service to turn that on, or make it available rather, and click Save. So here you can see that the service is available but not turned on yet because you don't have a NetBoot image to broadcast out. So that's why it's gray instead of green, which is what it would look like when it's on. So click on the NetBoot service and then click on the Settings button and then click on the General tab. And you're going to see here you're going to have the ports, that you can use to run the NetBoot service on. So, for the most part, it should be Ethernet. But if you have a Mac that has multiple NICs, just make sure you pick the right port that you want to use for this. And I was talking to one of the Apple reps here. You don't need to select client data, but if you leave it unchecked, you might get warnings from the server admin tool telling you, this is not checked off. It's just a caution. It should work fine if you leave it unchecked, but you need to check the images box. So once you do that, just click Save to save the changes. And so I had extra slides here that would probably take me over the allotted time I have. But I'm going to make them available. This would have shown you how to go through the setup process. But there's already going to be a session on that, so you're not really losing out on that. You can go to that tomorrow, and they're going to show you, how to run the DeployStudio Setup Assistant from scratch. But they won't be covering this portion, which I mentioned earlier. So there's going to be a part where it asks you, do you want to restrict access to some of these tools? And you can leave it blank and continue. But what I like to do is create restrictions. So at this moment, only the technicians have access to image in my department. But what I like to do is I create the DSprod tech group, and only technicians have access to that. But then there's a test group that only has access to run certain workflows. And the reason I do that is because I might be working on a new image, and I don't want people in production to start using that image without having tested it. So that's why I would separate that. Rusty Myers, who I talked to yesterday, he said he uses it to separate it based on different user groups. So like if they want to, if someone in chemistry or the biology department wants to install certain software, they'll have the runtime tool on their Mac, and they can just use that to install certain packages. So that's another way you can use this tool. But it's good to restrict access if you're going to do something like that. So the next part after you set up the DeployStudio server, you're going to go to the DeployStudio Setup Assistant. If you already ran the first part, it'll just take you back to the home screen here. You select the Create DeployStudio NetBoot Set option and click Continue. So here it just kind of tells you what's going to happen in the next few steps that you're going to take. So click Continue. You can kind of leave all this information here for the NetBoot set as it is. But if you have other NetBoot sets on your server already, you might want to make sure that it doesn't conflict with that. Otherwise, you might run into issues. Then it's going to ask you, what servers is the runtime tool going to connect to when you NetBoot. So I use specific servers, and because I only have one at the time, I use the same, server name for both dropdowns. So just make sure it's in the proper format, though. It's http server.company.com, and then the port DeployStudio uses is 680.
Now you're hosting your images on an HTTP web server, but if you had it in an Apple file share, that go back one. See where it says HTTP?
It's weird. It says that, but it's just to connect to the server. I'm not sure why it does that. But it is pulling it over AFP.
Yeah, you can't change that.
Yeah, you can't really change that. No, it looks. I know it looks like it's a web server, but it's not. I don't have the web service running on this Mac. The only service that I had running was the NetBoot service, and that's it. So, yeah.
The HTTP connection is for the DeployStudio runtime only. It still pulls the images from the AFP share.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. All right. So when you NetBoot for the first time, the first thing it does, it tries to load the runtime tool. Now automatically, because it's going to run that tool, it's going to ask you for user credentials. So you have to authenticate, put in whatever DeployStudio administrator account you have, and then it runs the runtime tool. If you want to skip that process of authenticating, you can put in credentials here, and it'll just automatically load into the runtime tool, and it saves you time. I'm using it that way now, but maybe later on I might have it so that users have to log in with their own credentials. It also has options for setting up ARD, VNC screen sharing. I haven't set that up, but I don't know if there are any issues with it in the current release. I don't know.
There's not, it works fine.
It works fine? OK. So yeah, you can use that feature. Then there's the runtime log window, which runs in the background. So it's pretty handy to have. I would avoid unchecking that option. Basically, what it does is it's like a terminal screen in the background, and it tells you what processes are running, error messages, progress of tasks, workflows, and things of that nature. So it's good to have in the background. And then there's the option to quit runtime automatically after a certain amount of seconds. So what that means is after you run a workflow, DeployStudio runtime tells you, do you want to continue so that you can run other workflows, or do you want to quit? If you quit and you're in a NetBoot set, what it's going to do is it's going to restart the machine, and it's going to probably go to the operating system that you have, you just re-imaged. If you have this option checked, though, and it's at that point where it says continue or quit, it's just automatically going to quit after 30 seconds. So I like to leave it on. I could probably make it just 1 second, but it doesn't really make that big of a difference. They restart either way. And then you get additional options to add extra tools to the NetBoot set. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're going to get then to the portion where it's going to ask you, where to create the NetBoot set. So if you've done everything right up to this point, it should just automatically fill this out for you. If you haven't, I would recommend going back to the server admin app and checking that out just to make sure. I mean, you can create your NetBoot set anywhere else, but it should really go here by default, especially if you have the NetBoot service running. I would make it the default because you probably don't have another NetBoot set at this point if this is the first time you're doing this. So on my machine, it took about 10 minutes to create the NetBoot image. It could be less or even more depending on your server. And so once you've done, it tells you it's been created. So you want to just exit that out. So click OK. So what you're going to do is you're going to now go back to the server admin app. And you're going to check the NetBoot service, click on Settings, click on the Images tab. And you're going to see here the NetBoot image has been loaded successfully. So it's set to default the way we wanted it. It's enabled, so it's available to be broadcasted out. And the last thing you really need to do is just click on Start NetBoot, and you've got a NetBoot set being broadcasted out to your Macs on that subnetwork. All right, so we've been talking about NetBoot sets here, but you have to go through the process of NetBooting. There's a session, I don't know if it's today or tomorrow, on NetBooting basics, which you should go to if you've never done this. But basically, NetBooting allows you to boot from a network. And it's the equivalent of Pixie booting on PCs, if you're familiar with that on the Windows side. If everything works right, all you have to really do is hold the N key on your Mac when it powers on, and you're going to get a flashing globe icon. If it connects to the NetBoot server correctly, then you get a spinning globe icon, I believe, and then it loads the NetBoot set, and you're good to go. I would recommend you probably work with your network team to do this, because in some organizations you might run into politics where they don't want any kind of imaging over the network. So just keep that in mind as you're doing this. We don't have that issue in our place, because we have a restricted network that's only for imaging. But we're trying to get that across the entire organization, which is where these tips might come in handy for you. So for NetBooting across subnets and VLANs, there are a few options. The first two, you can use a separate NIC for every subnet and VLAN, but that's probably not practical in most places. The second option is to use a NetBoot server for every subnet and VLAN. And again, that probably isn't practical for most places, so I'm not going to really go into detail on those. The most popular method, and the one that was recommended to use even by Apple, was the IP helper address method. And I'll talk about that briefly. I haven't implemented it yet. I'm hoping to, but we'll see how that goes. And then the other methods include using the bless command, which is pretty simple. You can do that in terminal. And you can also use port trunking to create virtual interfaces. The last option I wanted to include, although I'm not going to discuss it, you can use DHCP options on your DHCP server. And I mean, depending on how you have it set up, it might work, but it's very complicated to set up. And it's unreliable because if Apple releases new firmware, it might just break it. And so you might not be able to NetBoot on certain models that you have available. So here's an article that's pretty helpful that you can forward along to your network administrator team. Basically, with IP helper address, normally it's used to communicate client machines to the DHCP server so they can get IP addresses. Now, if you add a second IP helper address, what it would do is it would allow the NetBoot server to broadcast the NetBoot set and communicate with those MACs. And so from what I hear, at least, it shouldn't cause any extra traffic. It doesn't interfere with any other services. One of the concerns most people, sometimes network administrators might have is that it might respond to DHCP traffic. It shouldn't if you don't have the DHCP service running on your Mac. So you really shouldn't have any issues doing it. It's usually a political issue where they don't want to do it because they have worries or concerns, and they're, it's a Mac. Who knows how it might behave on, a Windows network or Linux network, whatever the case may be. So if you can't do that and you have subnets that you still want to NetBoot across, you can use this command and it should work. There's a more complicated version of this that's a little bit more detailed, but I've only had to use this so far, and it seems to work without any problems. It's just typing out bless -- netboot -- server, and then bsdp : / and the IP address. I've heard people say that you can use the host name, and that works fine, but I haven't had any luck with that. And you can see some of the other options that are available on the man page. If you just type in man bless in terminal. So because it's something that you can type in terminal, you can also script it. So with the help of someone from the Mac Enterprise mailing list, I was able to create this script. They kind of gave me the first part of it, which was to allow the script to run in root so that it prompts the user for the username, because these two commands have to run in sudo. So after it processes those commands, it restarts the machine. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward script to use. If you want to use it, go ahead. And just note, you need to have an account with a password, otherwise it's not going to work. And when I say the script, usually I use a dot command since it opens in terminal by default. All right, so this is something that was pretty interesting when I heard about it, especially if you have a Mac Mini that only has that one NIC on it. So VLANs, if you're not familiar, are virtual local area networks. It's defined by the 802.1q standard. And I took this from Wikipedia because it seemed simple enough to use here. But the important part here is VLANs have the same attributes as a physical LAN, but it allows end stations to be grouped together even if they're not on the same network switch. So if you can set up one port on one VLAN, you can use port trunking to allow multiple VLANs on that one port, which comes in really handy if you only have that Mac Mini with the one NIC. So for this, you will need to talk to your network administrator team. So if they haven't been very helpful up to this point, maybe they might open up to this. I don't know. That's actually how I started doing it at Pace University for a few VLANs. So what they need to do is they need to tag the network port that your server is on. And it's going to be used for multiple VLANs. And then what you need from them is going to be the VLAN tag number for each of those VLANs. And it's also going to be good to know what the default and the native VLAN is for that port. Because if you need to do any troubleshooting, you're going to want to know what network by default that port is running on. So to set up virtual interfaces, you're going to go to System Preferences. You're going to go to the Network Preference pane and click on the left gear and click on Manage Virtual Interfaces. So there's going to be a pop-up. Just click on the plus sign and click on New VLAN to add other VLANs. And it's going to prompt you for the VLAN name. It doesn't have to be anything specific. It can be something descriptive so that you know what VLAN it is. You're going to need the VLAN tag number, so use that. And then the interface. Again, it should be Ethernet, but if you have other interfaces, just make sure you pick the right one. And then click Create. So I added two virtual interfaces here, admin and ghost. And just take a note of the BSD name for each interface, because it's going to come in handy a bit later. So once you created the virtual interfaces, what you're gonna see is these new interfaces are available, but they don't have any IP addresses. Now I don't know if it's just because of the way the GUI works, if they're actually already picking up IP addresses but not displaying them, but they show up this way. So to kind of fix that. What you would do is click on Advanced, and then you're going to run the Renew DHCP lease and click OK. So they have IP addresses at this point. If you're using static IPs, obviously you can change that and set that up too. It doesn't really matter what you use. Just click Apply once you're done to save the changes that you made. So if you go now back to the server admin app, and you check the NetBoot service, you're going to see you're going to have additional Ethernet ports that you can use now to NetBoot. And it's very easy to manage now what VLANs you can NetBoot on. So you can kind of block off any NetBooting on certain VLANs if something's happening on that VLAN and you want to rule out the NetBooting being the issue. And you can see also the BSD names that I referred to earlier. So VLAN 0 and VLAN 1 refer to admin and the ghost VLANs that I created. So once it's set up, you can test it out. Just take another Mac from that VLAN and hold the N key to power on. Or you can go to System Preferences and go to the startup disk and look for the NetBoot disk and just reboot into that. All right, so the last portion here is on how to convert Windows 7 images for use in virtual machines. So kind of just to preface this, the Windows images in our environment aren't created by myself. There's a technician that already does that. And he maintains at least 4 images that he has to regularly update, and then additional ones for other departments, labs, and so on. So I don't want to add extra images that he has to keep updated because it just adds extra work for himself. And I already know, how frustrating it can be when you're doing field calls and having to update images at the same time. You run out of time to do these sort of things. So that's why I convert my images. So the major players that I know of, I don't know if others exist, are Oracle VirtualBox, VMware Fusion, and Parallels Desktop. Does anyone else use anything else?
That's why Parallels.
Parallels? OK. So we use VirtualBox at Pace because as a university, we can use it for free without any issues. You can check out their licensing terms. It might be free, or you can get it, at a certain license fee. I'm not sure, how that would work out. But one thing I've noticed also with it is that it has a powerful command line interface, and that allows you the option to script VM configurations if you have to deal with that a lot. And so if you check out their online manual and look up VBox Manage, you can see how you can script that. It's pretty handy, and I'll show you an example. VirtualBox also allows you to use different virtual hard drive formats. So you can use VDI for VirtualBox, VHD from Microsoft, VMDK from VMware, and HCD from Parallels. So this is an example from Rusty Myers that he put up on his blog. It's just to kind of give you an idea. I know it's probably pretty small on the screen there, but you can check it out on his blog. He uses it, I think, with as a container as part of a container in Platypus that gets applied to a DMG that has a virtual hard drive image. So it's pretty neat if you want to, configure VM configurations through VirtualBox. So there's different tools that you can use to go about, converting these images. I use two. The first one I use is disk to VHD, and all these tools are Windows only, unfortunately. But they're free usually, so you shouldn't have any issues using them, especially if you're having to deal with Windows 7 images. So disk to VHD, what it does, it just takes the hard drive that you have attached to your computer. It can be internally or externally, and it just creates a VHD file. It's also pretty cool because you can mount those files in Windows 7 and edit them if you wanted to. And then once I got that VHD file, I can convert it again now to a VMDK format. So for that I use Darwin V2V image converter, which is also free. And it's pretty neat because now if I have a VMDK file, I can tell users, oh, you want a virtual machine? Well, you can get VirtualBox, which is free, or you can use VMware Fusion if you want to pay for something because we already have an image. I mean, they still have the option to use Parallels, but it just takes a bit of extra time because now we have to, create an image or install Windows 7 for them from scratch. And there's also VMware Converter and Parallel Transporter Agent. I haven't used Converter, but I imagine it's the same as Transporter Agent, where it just migrates a physical machine running live into the VM itself. I imagine it works well.
Yeah.
That's how it does it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now you could go both ways now.
So from a VM to a physical machine too? Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, so you can use that depending on your environment. And if you don't have to do a lot of VM installations, then this might be the way to go. Especially if you're moving a user from a PC to a Mac and they just need certain applications from their PC running on their Mac in a virtual machine. Did you have a question? No? Okay. Yeah.
Can also make VMDKs.
Ghost?
Yeah.
Oh. I gotta check that out. Yeah. The last tool I haven't used, but it seems to do the same thing. I hear is WinImage. It's supposed to be similar, I guess, to StarWin V2V image converter. So as you're doing these conversions, just keep in mind some of these hard drives, depending on the size that you're using for the image, it might take, and limit that image to a 100 gigabyte hard drive if that's how big the hard drive is that you have the image on. And in other cases, if let's say the image is 20 gigs on a 100 gig hard drive, it might say, oh, well, we're going to fix the size on this virtual hard drive image, and it's going to be a 100 gig file. Now, we don't have the bandwidth for that. I don't know if you guys do. That's a big file to transfer over for users. So you want to try to make sure it's a dynamic or flexible size hard drive image so that it goes from 20 gigs, which is a hard drive image, and then it can expand to 100 gigs. And if you use VirtualBox, I believe there are ways also to kind of increase it from 100 gigs if you want to use more space for the VM using VBox Manage. So one of the things that VBox Manage lets you do, and this you can do on a Mac if you already have that either a raw image file or a VDI file or a VHD, you can use this command line to convert it to another format. And in my example, let's say I wanted to do this for VMware Fusion. So what I would do is, in VMware Fusion, I would create the VM first. And at that point, I don't want to do anything else to it. I just shut it down. I don't suspend it or put it to sleep, but I actually shut down the VM. And then I had to replace the VMDK files that are inside the virtual machine itself, the virtual machine container. So to do that, you go to your home directory and you look for the virtual machines folder. And there's going to be a file there with the extension of .vmware.vm. Just right-click that and click on Show Package Contents. And so in there, you're going to see a bunch of files. You'll probably see a good amount of VMDK files. Just take a note of the file name. You're going to delete all these files, or you can move them out if you want to kind of play it safe. And then just replace the VMDK file you created from the VBoxManage tool, and just replace it with the ones you deleted. So once you do this, if you load up VMware Fusion, it should pick up the virtual image, and if you have it running sysprep or whatever the case is, it's going to go through that process. The reason you can't just tell it to use an existing disk, which VMware Fusion does give you that option, is because for some reason it just doesn't let you pick it. I'm not sure if this command line tool is not formatting it a certain way or there's something that's missing. But it will read it if you use these steps. So. All right. So we also want to convert images for Windows 7 to use in Boot Camp. So we use DeployStudio to do this. Again, you can configure Windows however you want. Some use a combination of Microsoft deployment tools or Windows automated installation kit. Whatever you use, just make sure you have Windows configured, and then have it ready to be captured by DeployStudio. So what I use, the method I use is, I'll re-image again a hard drive on an external hard drive, and then just plug that into a Mac. And then I'll NetBoot my machine where I can run the runtime tool. And from there, it picks up the external hard drive, and I can run a workflow that creates an image off of that. You can also attempt to capture an image from a VM if you make your images on a VM. I know the technician I work with creates the images on a VM, but I don't know that, and you guys can tell me if anyone's gotten this working, if you can actually NetBoot on a VM. I know you can PXE boot, but I don't know if you can NetBoot. Has anyone ever tried that at all? Any luck?
Sort of. I deploy WinPE.
Okay.
As part of the Windows side, and then it will wipe out the WinPE image and then put on what I need to put on.
All right. Yeah. So you can definitely get creative with how you deploy your images and capture them. So if you're using DeployStudio to do this, it has a few default workflows you can use. The one you would use in this case would be create a master from a volume. But I like to create my own workflows that are specific just to capturing that Windows image. So you would run the DeployStudio admin tool to create your workflow. So when you get there, click on the plus sign all the way at the bottom, and it allows you to create a workflow. You can name it whatever you want. Doesn't have to be anything specific. I used create a Windows image. And you're going to select the task. So I didn't have space to take a screenshot of that, but you might see this tomorrow if you go to the DeployStudio session. In the middle where you see disk image, it says drop a task. If you click on the plus there, it's going to give you a left menu, and you can kind of just drag and drop any tasks you want. So I only use this one called disk image. And then you can pretty much just follow what I have here. You can leave source blank, type compressed, format auto detect, and then at least for now, and I don't know if it's ever going to change, you want to make sure you uncheck image NTFS volumes with the Mac OS tools for multicast deployment, because I think starting with 10.6.7, that sort of broke, and it hasn't really been fixed, and I don't think they're going to fix it. But if you use the other options, try to create intermediate files on a local volume, and then try to shrink the NTFS volume size before imaging, you should be pretty good. So select those options and click on Save. And now you have your image. So you have your image, but you want to deploy it now to other computers. So we have to go through the boot camp restoration process in DeployStudio. So as you're doing this, the first thing you want to keep in mind is you want to have a fat partition on that Mac that's available for the boot camp image to be deployed to. You can use disk utility to do this. You can use boot camp assistant, although I think in line they started requiring you to have a Windows installation media. So I'm not sure how far you can get without having the media with you. You can also use the disk util resize volume command in terminal. But once you got that partition and you've applied the image to that fat partition, you're going to also want to make sure you have the boot camp drivers installed. And so you can download the boot camp drivers at least for line by running the boot camp assistant, and it gives you the option to download it to folder or USB drive. And depending on how you sysprep, prepare your machines, if you use sysprep and use an answer file, you can use the MSI exec command in Windows to allow it to process and run those MSI and MSP installers that Apple provides for the boot camp installers. So if you're not familiar with that and you want to know the tags, you can just open up the command prompt or the run menu and just type out MSI exec and then / question mark, and it'll give you the options, parameters that you can use for that. I was told also, I was speaking to another guy earlier who said if you use this method and it does work, one of the issues you might run into is after you do this, because certain drivers like reset, I guess, the performance assessment that Windows runs, you have to kind of rerun that. So there's a command called WinSat that you can run afterwards through the answer file, I suppose, or through a script, whatever method you use, if you want to do this all through an answer file. And again, just like earlier, if you want to create a workflow in DeployStudio, you can. There's a default one called Restore Master on a volume that you can use and change the options, but I like to make my own workflows. So go back to the DeployStudio admin app and then create a workflow by clicking on the plus sign. Name the workflow whatever you want. Then select the restore task, and then when you see this for the first time, you're going to see a lot of things checked off, and a lot of it is specific just to Mac, so it wouldn't even apply to Windows if you're capturing or restoring a Windows image. But I would just uncheck it because it doesn't really need to be checked. You can set the target volume to user selection so that they can select what partition they're going to restore to. Select NTFS if you're doing Windows 7. And the last two things that you have to check are expand a restored NTFS volume and then set as a default startup volume. So the first one is pretty important because if you have a 20 gig image that was compressed to 18 gigs and you want to apply it to a partition that's 100 gigs, you can do that with if you have this option checked. Or you can apply it to a 200 gig image, 200 gig partition, or whatever the case is. So it allows you to expand the partition space that the boot camp image will use up. So once you have this all selected, just click Save, and you're pretty much done. So how does this all help? In our environment, we didn't have anything in place previously, so. If someone came in saying, "Oh, we have an issue with a Mac," and we need to reinstall the operating system, we would tell them, "Oh, do you have the restore disk for that Mac?" And we would have to wait. So that that takes time, and then we got to run through the installation. Then we got to run the software updates. We might have to reinstall software manually. So you can see it kind of prolongs the process to support these Macs that come in. So now we have images. If someone wants to have their Mac re-imaged, we don't have to rely on those disks anymore. And if someone needs to have their Mac re-imaged on the field, because we can do NetBooting, we can go ahead and NetBoot over the network and re-image that Mac, or do whatever else we need to do on the NetBoot set. And if a client wants a Mac on their Windows on their Mac, we can easily configure them configure that for them, and we can give them two options, which is Boot Camp and a VM option of VirtualBox or VMware Fusion. And I mean, this sets the foundation for other things too. If you wanted to go other routes, because we create packages and use packages with InstaDMG, we can also use them with slight modifications in DeployStudio. So we can kind of go the thin imaging method. You go with the thin imaging method, and forget about reimaging and just apply the packages to that Mac out of the box. And these should be pretty basic things you should have set up if you're going to be supporting Macs, because it allows you to deploy different Macs and support them in many ways, just like you can PCs. And one of the things I've learned in kind of researching a lot of this stuff and learning how to support Macs is that there are a lot of great commercial tools that do a lot of these things, but there's also a lot of free tools that do the same thing. So if your department wants you to support Macs and they're telling you, I want you to do this, but you got to do it at a cost that is free, basically. There are tools that can do that for you. You don't have to rely on getting expensive software management suites, imaging suites to do all this. And it's also pretty good to know how to package installers. This is especially important if you get into modular imaging. You don't necessarily have to repackage everything, but just understanding how those packages can be applied to those images is important. And the same goes for scripting. If you're going to configure different settings on a OS image, it's probably good practice to do this through scripts so that you can maintain certain settings on that image. And whatever you can do in terminal, you can pretty much do in a script. So it's it's pretty basic. You don't have to get it too complicated. If you want to introduce logic to it, then you can read up on maybe bash scripting to use if logic, or whatever the case may be. And I work in a Microsoft environment, but just because that's the case, it doesn't mean that I can't support the Macs that are out there at the same level that we do for the PCs. So if you're a technician or administrator, the concepts in supporting these machines is really the same. It's just all about the tools that you're using, and you might have to learn new tools, but that's always the case in IT. And the communities that surround these tools, for DeployStudio, InstaDMG, Monkey, and other tools that are out there, are pretty responsive. That's one thing that's pretty great about these communities. You ask a question, you describe the issue you're having, and they're pretty good about replying back and giving you potential solutions, or even if it's something simple that you might not have known that everyone else knows, they'll give you an answer, and it's just an extra person, and you kind of just pass that knowledge on along. And so when I came here last year, one of the things they said was, if you haven't registered for the Mac Enterprise mailing list, you should probably do so. And I did so, and I've got like about 10,000 emails in a folder on my Exchange account, and it keeps growing. You get like 100 emails sometimes a day, but I don't respond to everything, but I do read it all, and even if it doesn't apply to me now, I can say, oh yeah, I have a theory of this if it comes up for me later in the future. So it's good to join things like that and read up in other communities, because you're bound to gain knowledge, which is going to just help you down the line as you're supporting Macs. So I wanted to include some extra links. The first link is a documentation that I created for InstaDMG, because one of the things that I found when using that tool is that there's a lot of documentation out there, but it's really not all in one place. You have to go to different Wikipedia pages. You might have to search through certain forums, and it's just not really centralized. So I created a documentation. It's pretty good. It goes over different features, and you can use it at no charge. It's just available. There are other forums you can use. For InstaDMG, there's the AFP website that you can check out. And then for DeployStudio, there's a very extensive guide that you can use that kind of goes through everything you can do with it. It might be a bit dated now because it was created on Snow Leopard, and obviously they've added other features to DeployStudio, but it hasn't changed that drastically that you won't be able to apply the same principles as you're setting up DeployStudio. And then these are extra links on netbooting across subnets, and then dealing with the recovery partition. If you want to recreate that from scratch or copy that with DeployStudio that Rich Troutman put up on his blog. Yeah, yeah, right there. So that's pretty much it. I don't know if anyone has any questions that I can answer.